The morning sun cast long shadows across Ridgewater Air Force Base as Rebecca Martinez adjusted her grip on the heavy toolbox. At 31, she had learned that first impressions rarely told the whole story, but she also knew that most people never looked past them. Her brown hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her coveralls bore the faded stains of hydraulic fluid and engine oil that marked her as just another maintenance worker. "Training pilots stay behind the line," barked Lieutenant Commander James Harrison, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "Don't get in the way of the flight line operations." Rebecca set down her toolbox without argument, stepping back as the sleek Fighting Falcon rolled across the tarmac. Around her, other base personnel exchanged knowing glances and suppressed smiles. Another civilian contractor who didn't understand military protocol, their expressions seemed to say. Another outsider who thought working on military aircraft was the same as fixing cars in a garage. She had arrived at Ridgewater 6 months ago through an aviation technical exchange program, her credentials listing her as an experienced aircraft mechanic with specializations in hydraulic systems and avionics. What the paperwork didn't mention was the reason she had left her previous position, or why someone with her qualifications was willing to take an assistant crew chief position at a base, where most of the other civilians were fresh out of technical school. Rebecca had chosen silence from day one. She didn't talk about flight hours or request cockpit time for familiarization flights. She didn't share war stories or try to impress the younger officers with tales of exotic aircraft or dangerous missions. Instead, she arrived early, methodically worked through her checklists, and stayed late to handlog every minor variation in pressure readings and system performance. The other maintenance staff had quickly labeled her as overly cautious, maybe even a little paranoid. While they relied on computer diagnostics and rushed through routine inspections to meet tight schedules, Rebecca would spend extra time examining components that the system said were functioning normally. She cleaned sensors that looked clean, checked connections that tested fine, and maintained detailed handwritten logs that went far beyond what regulations required. "You sure you're not overthinking this?" asked Danny Rodriguez, one of the younger technicians, as he watched Rebecca carefully inspect the hydraulic line that had passed all its automated tests. "The computer says it's good to go." Rebecca looked up from her work, her hands still steady on the component. "Computers are excellent at telling you what they're programmed to detect," she said quietly. "They're not so good at catching the things that fall between the parameters." Lieutenant Commander Harrison, who oversaw the civilian maintenance contracts, seemed to take particular pleasure in reminding Rebecca of her place in the hierarchy. During briefings, he would assign her the most mundane tasks while giving the more interesting work to technicians with half her experience. When she tried to offer input on technical issues, he would cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Leave the complex analysis to the people who understand military aviation," he would say, his tone suggesting that civilian contractors were barely qualified to change oil and rotate tires. The other officers followed Harrison's lead, treating Rebecca as a temporary inconvenience rather than a valuable team member. They made jokes about her methodical approach, calling her by-the-book Betty, and suggesting she was trying too hard to impress people who already knew she wasn't cut out for high-stakes military work. But there were moments when Rebecca's careful attention to detail revealed itself as something more than paranoia. Late one evening, as the night shift was preparing for a routine training mission, she noticed something wrong with the angle of attack sensor on one of the Fighting Falcons. The component had passed all its diagnostic tests, but something about the way it caught the hangar lights seemed off. She approached the duty pilot, a young officer named Captain Mike Thompson, and spoke quietly so as not to create a scene. "Sir, if you experience any unusual vibrations between 160 and 180 knots, don't trust the stall warning system. There might be interference from a loose sensor mount. Captain Thompson looked at her with surprise. How do you know that? Have you seen this problem before? Rebecca's expression remained neutral, but for just a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Just a feeling based on the component alignment, she said. Better safe than sorry. The captain completed his mission without incident, but when he returned, he sought out Rebecca in the maintenance bay. You were right, he told her. Hit that exact vibration pattern at 170 knots. Did exactly what you suggested, and everything smoothed out perfectly. He paused, studying her face. Where did you learn to read aircraft like that? But Rebecca had already turned back to her work, and the moment passed without an answer. The next morning brought an inspection team from the regional command, and Lieutenant Commander Harrison was determined to show off his efficient operation. He assigned Rebecca to basic cleaning duties, keeping her well away from any technical discussions or system demonstrations. Stick to what you know, he told her in front of the visiting officers. Leave the real aircraft knowledge to the professionals. As Rebecca gathered her cleaning supplies, a gust of wind caught her work jacket, causing it to flutter open for just a moment. On the left sleeve, barely visible beneath the fabric, was a patch that most people wouldn't have recognized. But the visiting maintenance chief, a grizzled master sergeant named William Banks, happened to glance over at exactly the right moment. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. The patch was faded black with a white hawk clutching silver lightning bolts. Hand-stitched below the hawk were the letters that made Master Sergeant Banks set his cup down with shaking hands. Night Falcon 1-3. The conversation in the hangar seemed to slow down, as if the air itself had grown thicker. Several of the older enlisted personnel had noticed the patch as well, and a strange tension settled over the group. It was the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes they've been making assumptions that might have been very, very wrong. Rebecca caught the reaction and quickly adjusted her jacket, covering the patch completely. But it was too late. The damage, if it could be called that, had been done. Master Sergeant Banks approached her slowly, his expression carefully neutral. Ma'am, he said quietly, might I have a word with you privately? Rebecca nodded, following him to a corner of the hangar where their conversation wouldn't be overheard. Banks looked at her for a long moment, his experienced eyes taking in details that the younger officers had missed. The way she moved with unconscious precision around aircraft. The way her hands automatically checked for loose panels and potential hazards, even when she was just walking by. The way she listened to engine sounds with the focused attention of someone who had learned to trust her life to those mechanical rhythms. Night Falcon Squadron, Banks said, his voice barely above a whisper. That unit was disbanded 7 years ago. Rebecca's expression didn't change, but Banks caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Yes, sir, it was. The records are still classified, but word gets around in our community. There was a pilot assigned to that squadron. Call sign Falcon 1-3, female pilot. Disappeared from service records after a mission went bad. Rebecca was quiet for a long time, her gaze fixed on the aircraft being serviced across the hangar. Finally, she spoke. Sometimes people don't disappear, Master Sergeant. Sometimes they just land in a different place than they expected. Banks nodded slowly, understanding more than Rebecca had actually said. Ma'am, I don't know what brought you here, and I respect that some stories aren't meant to be told. But I want you to know that if you ever need someone who understands the weight of carrying certain patches, you know where to find me. As Rebecca returned to her work, she could feel the subtle shift in the atmosphere around her. Word would spread, she knew. It always did in military communities. But she also knew that respect earned through rumors was different from respect earned through actions. And she had learned, through painful experience, that action spoke louder than any patch ever could. That night, As she walked alone across the flight line toward her quarters, Rebecca pulled out a worn coin from her jacket pocket. The edges were hand-carved, and the inscription read simply, "No lights, still land." She had carried that coin for 7 years. Through sleepless nights and career changes and the long process of learning how to live with decisions that couldn't be undone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that her quiet competence was more than just thoroughness. But tonight, she allowed herself to remember what it felt like to be trusted with lives that depended on her judgment. The patch on her sleeve wasn't a trophy or a conversation starter. It was a reminder of promises made and kept, and of the responsibility that came with knowledge earned through experience that most people would never understand. Rebecca Martinez had once been Falcon 1-3, but that was a different life. Now, she was simply a maintenance worker who happened to know more about aircraft than her paperwork suggested. And for now, that was enough. The morning briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-flight energy as pilots reviewed weather reports and mission parameters. Rebecca sat in the back corner, her maintenance checklist spread across a small table, but her attention was focused on the meteorological data being displayed on the main screen. The atmospheric conditions showed a pattern that made her frown slightly. "Lieutenant." Commander Harrison stood at the front of the room, outlining the day's training objectives. "We'll have 2 Fighting Falcons conducting air-to-air intercept training over the northern sector," he announced. "Weather looks ideal. Visibility unlimited. Minimal turbulence expected." Rebecca studied the pressure gradients on the weather map more carefully. The data showed a temperature inversion layer forming near the mountain range, combined with unusual wind patterns that could create electromagnetic interference. She had seen similar conditions before, and they had a tendency to play tricks. On navigation systems, after the briefing concluded and pilots began filing out, Rebecca approached the operations desk where Harrison was reviewing flight plans. "Sir," she said respectfully, "I noticed some unusual atmospheric conditions in the northern sector that might affect Ms. Martinez." Harrison interrupted, not looking up from his paperwork. "Your job is to make sure the aircraft are mechanically sound, not to second-guess our meteorology team." "I understand, sir. But these specific conditions can create interference patterns that might not show up on standard weather. Are you questioning the competence of our weather officers?" Harrison's voice had taken on an edge that made several nearby personnel look up from their work. Rebecca kept her tone level and professional. "No, sir. I'm simply suggesting that based on experience with similar atmospheric conditions, it might be worth having backup navigation procedures in place." Harrison finally looked up, his expression clearly annoyed. "Ms. Martinez, I'm going to make something very clear. You are a civilian maintenance contractor. You are not a meteorologist. You are not a navigation specialist. And you are certainly not qualified to make recommendations about flight operations. Your job is to turn wrenches and fill out maintenance logs. Leave the flying to the people who actually know what they're doing." The conversation had grown loud enough to attract attention from other personnel in the operations center. Rebecca could feel their eyes on her, some curious, others embarrassed by the public dressing down. She nodded quietly and returned to her checklist, but the dismissal stung more than she cared to admit. Captain Thompson, who had witnessed the exchange, approached her table a few minutes later. "Don't let Harrison get to you," he said quietly. "He's been passed over for promotion twice, and he takes it out on anyone he thinks might be showing him up." "I wasn't trying to show anyone up," Rebecca replied, still studying the weather data. "I just wanted to make sure everyone comes home safely." Thompson sat down across from her, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't know what your background is, but that advice you gave me last week was spot on. Where did you really learn to read aircraft systems like that?" Rebecca glanced up, meeting his eyes briefly before returning to her paperwork. "Experience," she said simply. Sometimes expensive experience. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Rebecca would identify potential issues or suggest procedural modifications based on her observations, and Harrison would systematically shut her down. When she recommended additional inspection protocols for aircraft operating in high-temperature conditions, he assigned her to inventory duty instead. When she suggested modifications to the pre-flight checklist based on component failure patterns she had noticed, he told her that military procedures didn't need input from civilian mechanics. The other maintenance staff began to distance themselves from Rebecca, not wanting to be associated with someone who seemed to constantly clash with leadership. Danny Rodriguez, who had initially been friendly, started avoiding her during breaks. "Look, Martinez," he said one afternoon when she tried to discuss a hydraulic system anomaly she had discovered, "maybe you should just focus on doing your job the way they want it done. All this extra analysis isn't helping your reputation around here." But Rebecca couldn't simply ignore what she saw. Her training and experience had taught her that small problems became big problems when they were overlooked. And big problems in aviation meant people didn't come home. She continued her detailed inspections and maintained her comprehensive logs, even as it became clear that her thoroughness was being viewed as insubordination. The breaking point came during a routine maintenance inspection of the base's primary training aircraft. Rebecca was examining the avionics bay when she noticed something troubling. The primary navigation computer showed normal diagnostic readings, but there was slight corrosion on a connector that could cause intermittent failures under specific conditions. She documented her findings and submitted a maintenance recommendation to ground the aircraft until the component could be replaced. The paperwork made its way up the chain of command and landed on Harrison's desk just as he was preparing for a high-visibility demonstration flight for visiting congressional representatives. Harrison stormed into the maintenance bay, clutching Rebecca's report. "What is this nonsense about grounding aircraft for cosmetic corrosion?" he demanded. "Do you have any idea what kind of embarrassment it would cause to cancel a demonstration flight based on paranoid speculation from a civilian contractor?" Rebecca stood her ground, though her voice remained calm. "Sir, the corrosion is on a critical navigation connector. Under certain atmospheric conditions, particularly with the electromagnetic interference we've been seeing in the northern sector, it could cause..." "Enough." Harrison's voice echoed through the hangar. "I've had it with your constant doom and gloom predictions. You're not here to make policy decisions or ground aircraft based on your amateur analysis." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper that only Rebecca could hear. "Let me make something very clear, Ms. Martinez. Your contract is up for review next month. If you want to keep this job, you'll limit your activities to basic maintenance tasks and keep your opinions about flight operations to yourself. Are we understood?" Rebecca felt the familiar weight of being in an impossible position. She could back down, keep quiet, and potentially watch someone get hurt by a problem she had identified. Or she could continue to speak up and risk losing her job, along with any chance of helping prevent future accidents. "I understand your position, sir," she said finally, "but I have a responsibility to report safety concerns regardless of the consequences to my employment." Harrison's face flushed red. "Your responsibility is to do what I tell you to do. Nothing more, nothing less." As he walked away, Rebecca heard him muttering to his assistant about problem civilians who don't understand their place. The message was clear. She was being marked as a troublemaker, someone whose contract would not be renewed. That evening, as Rebecca sat in her quarters reviewing technical manuals, she thought about the decision she was facing. She had built a new life here, quiet and stable, away from the high-stakes world that had cost her so much 7 years ago. But she was being forced to choose between keeping that life and staying true to the principles that had guided her through much darker times. She pulled out her worn coin and turned it over in her hands. "No lights, still land," she read for the 1,000th time. The phrase had multiple meanings, but at its core, it was about finding a way to succeed, even when all the normal support systems had failed. Rebecca had learned to land without lights before. Now she was going to have to learn how to fight without authority, how to protect people who didn't even know they needed protection, and how to do it all while maintaining the quiet professionalism that had become her trademark. The patch on her sleeve represented more than just her past. It represented a commitment to bringing people home safely, regardless of the personal cost. And some commitments, she had learned, were worth keeping even when the lights went out. The demonstration flight was scheduled for Thursday morning, with 3 congressional representatives and a defense contractor delegation observing flight operations. Lieutenant Commander Harrison had spent the better part of the week ensuring that everything would run smoothly, from the timing of aircraft movements to the coffee service for the VIP observation deck. Rebecca had spent the same week quietly documenting every instance of the navigation system anomaly she had identified. The corroded connector was causing intermittent signal drops that lasted only milliseconds, barely noticeable during routine flights but potentially catastrophic under stress conditions. She had recorded 17 separate instances over 5 days, each one occurring when the aircraft encountered specific combinations of altitude, temperature, and electromagnetic interference. On Wednesday evening, she submitted her final report through official channels, complete with detailed photographs, diagnostic data, and her professional recommendation to ground the aircraft until the faulty component could be replaced. The repair would take less than 4 hours and cost under $300 in parts. The response came back within an hour, stamped with Harrison's signature. Maintenance request denied. Aircraft cleared for all scheduled operations. Rebecca stared at the rejection notice, feeling a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had been in similar situations before, times when she knew something was wrong, but couldn't convince the decision-makers to take action. 7 years ago, that kind of institutional failure had cost lives. She wasn't going to let it happen. Again, Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, perfect flying weather according to the meteorological reports. The VIPs arrived in a convoy of black SUVs, their security details spreading out across the tarmac as photographers documented their tour of the base facilities. Rebecca was assigned to basic ground crew duties, keeping her well away from the demonstration aircraft and any interaction with the visiting dignitaries. She watched from a distance as Harrison proudly explained the capabilities of the Fighting Falcon to the congressional delegation, his voice carrying across the flight line as he described the advanced avionics and navigation systems. "This aircraft represents the cutting edge of military aviation technology," Harrison declared, gesturing toward the gleaming fighter. "Every system has been thoroughly tested and certified to the highest standards of safety and reliability." Rebecca felt sick. She knew that at least one of those systems had a documented defect that could prove fatal under the right circumstances. But she also knew that speaking up now, in front of the VIPs and media representatives, would be viewed as an act of sabotage against the entire base. Captain Thompson was scheduled to pilot the demonstration flight, a routine air-to-air intercept scenario that would showcase the aircraft's maneuverability and advanced systems. As he conducted his pre-flight inspection, Rebecca caught his eye and gave him a subtle signal to meet her away from the main group. "Captain," she said quietly, "I need you to know that there's a potential navigation system issue with your aircraft. If you experience any intermittent signal loss, especially in the northern sector where we've been seeing electromagnetic interference, trust your backup systems and manual navigation." Thompson frowned. "What kind of issue?" This wasn't mentioned in the briefing. It's documented in the maintenance logs, but the flight has been approved despite the anomaly. Just promise me you'll be extra vigilant about system status, especially if you're operating near the interference zone." Before Thompson could respond, Harrison's voice boomed across the tarmac. "Captain Thompson, we're ready for your briefing with the VIP group." As Thompson walked away, Rebecca saw him glance back with a troubled expression. She knew she had put him in an impossible position, giving him information that contradicted his official briefing while expecting him to fly a demonstration mission with congressional representatives watching. The flight proceeded normally for the first 20 minutes. Thompson executed a series of precise maneuvers, demonstrating the aircraft's agility and responsiveness while maintaining constant radio communication with the control tower. The VIPs nodded approvingly as Harrison provided commentary on the technical sophistication of American military aviation. Then, as the aircraft entered the northern sector for the final phase of the demonstration, Rebecca's worst fears materialized. "Tower, this is Falcon 27, experiencing intermittent navigation system anomalies." Thompson's voice crackled over the radio. "Primary GPS showing erratic readings. Backup systems cycling." In the VIP observation area, conversation stopped as the delegation turned their attention to the radio speakers. Harrison's confident smile faltered as he realized that his carefully choreographed demonstration was about to become a public relations nightmare. "Falcon 27, tower copies your nav system anomaly. Please switch to secondary navigation and return to base," the tower controller responded, his voice professionally calm despite the obvious concern. Rebecca watched the situation unfold with growing dread. She knew that Thompson was now flying with degraded navigation capability in an area prone to electromagnetic interference. Exactly the conditions under which the corroded connector was most likely to fail completely. "Tower, Falcon 27. Secondary navigation is also showing intermittent failures. I'm getting conflicting altitude and heading information from multiple systems." The congressional delegation was now actively paying attention to the radio chatter, their expressions shifting from polite interest to genuine concern. Harrison was sweating despite the cool morning air, his careful demonstration dissolving into the kind of emergency that would generate investigations and uncomfortable questions about maintenance procedures. Rebecca made a decision that she knew would end her career at Ridgewater Air Force Base. She walked directly to the VIP observation area, despite the security personnel who moved to intercept her. "Excuse me," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I need to speak to the tower controller immediately. I have information relevant to this emergency." Harrison spun around, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. "Ms. Martinez, return to your assigned duties immediately. You have no business. I documented 17 instances of this exact navigation failure over the past week." Rebecca continued, speaking directly to the ranking congressional representative. "I submitted a maintenance request to ground this aircraft until the faulty component could be replaced. That request was denied by Lieutenant Commander Harrison." The silence that followed was deafening. Security personnel looked uncertainly between Rebecca and Harrison, unsure whether to remove her or listen to what she had to say. The congressional delegation exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the implications of what they had just heard. Harrison's voice was barely controlled as he addressed Rebecca. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the premises." But the ranking congressman, a man named David Walsh, who served on the House Armed Services Committee, held up his hand. "Actually, I think we need to hear what this woman has to say. If she identified a safety issue that was ignored, that's exactly the kind of problem we're here to investigate." Rebecca pulled out her documentation folder, the one she had prepared in case this moment came. "The navigation system has a corroded connector that causes intermittent failures under specific atmospheric conditions. The pilot is currently experiencing those exact conditions. If the system fails completely while he's trying to land, he could lose instrument guidance at a critical moment. Thompson's voice came over the radio again, more tense now. Tower, I'm showing complete navigation failure. I need vectors for immediate return to base, and I'll need ground-controlled approach for landing. The tower controller's response was swift and professional. Falcon 27, turn to heading 180, descend to flight level 150. We're setting up emergency approach procedures. Rebecca stepped forward, addressing the controller directly. Sir, based on the interference patterns I've documented, the pilot should avoid the direct approach from the north. The electromagnetic interference in that sector will compound his navigation problems. Route him through the southern approach corridor, even though it's longer. Harrison exploded. You are not authorized to provide flight guidance. You're a maintenance contractor, not an air traffic controller. But the congressman was now actively interested. What's your background, Ms. Martinez? How do you know about electromagnetic interference patterns and approach procedures? Rebecca met his gaze steadily. I have experience with navigation failures. In hostile environments, sir. Experience that tells me this pilot needs to avoid the interference zone until his systems can be properly diagnosed. The tower controller looked between Harrison and Rebecca, clearly caught between protocol and practical necessity. Finally, he made his decision. Falcon 27, we're vectoring you through the southern approach for precautionary reasons. Maintain current heading and altitude until further notice. Thompson's voice came back, calmer now. Tower, copy southern approach. That's probably wise given the system instability I'm experiencing. As the drama played out over the radio, Rebecca knew that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. She had publicly contradicted her commanding officer in front of congressional representatives, revealed maintenance issues that had been officially deemed non-critical, and essentially accused the base leadership of ignoring safety concerns. For the sake of political appearances, Harrison stepped close to her, his voice a whisper filled with venom. You've just ended your career, Martinez. Not just here, but anywhere in military aviation. I'll make sure you never work on another government aircraft as long as I have any influence. Rebecca looked back at him calmly, her hand unconsciously moving to touch the hidden patch on her sleeve. Some things are more important than careers, Commander. Like making sure pilots come home alive. The landing proceeded without further incident, Thompson touching down safely, despite the continued navigation system anomalies. But Rebecca knew that the real battle was just beginning. She had chosen to fight back, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that decision. As security personnel finally moved to escort her from the flight line, she heard Congressman Walsh telling his aide to schedule meetings with the base commander and the maintenance review board. The investigation that Harrison had feared was now inevitable, and Rebecca's documentation would be at the center of it. She had learned 7 years ago that sometimes the most important victories came at the highest personal cost. Now she was about to find out if that lesson still applied. The base security office was a sterile room with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Rebecca sat across a metal table from Captain Jennifer Woods, the base security officer assigned to handle what was being officially termed a maintenance protocol incident. Her personal effects had been confiscated, including her documentation. Folder, maintenance logs, and the one coin she always carried. Ms. Martinez, Captain Woods began, her tone professionally neutral. You understand that your actions during the congressional demonstration constitute a serious breach of protocol. Lieutenant Commander Harrison has filed formal charges against you for insubordination, interference with flight operations, and unauthorized disclosure of maintenance information. Rebecca nodded calmly. I understand the charges, ma'am. I also understand that Captain Thompson landed safely because someone was willing to speak up about a documented safety hazard. Captain Woods made notes in her file. Your contract includes specific clauses about chain of command and proper channels for reporting concerns. Why didn't you follow those procedures? I did follow those procedures, Rebecca replied. I submitted 17 separate maintenance reports documenting the navigation system anomaly. I provided detailed analysis of the failure conditions. I recommended grounding the aircraft until the faulty component could be replaced. Every one of those reports was reviewed and denied by Lieutenant Commander Harrison. The security officer looked up from her notes. Do you have copies of those reports? Rebecca shook her head. All my documentation was in the folder that was confiscated. But the maintenance database should have digital copies of every submission. What Rebecca didn't mention was that she had learned long ago to keep backup copies of important documents. Hidden in her quarters was a complete duplicate set of her analysis, along with photographs and diagnostic data that painted a clear picture of the navigation system's progressive failure pattern. After 2 hours of questioning, Rebecca was released pending the outcome of the investigation. She was barred from the flight line and maintenance areas, effectively suspended from her duties while the base conducted its review. As she walked back to her quarters, she could feel the stares and whispered conversations of other personnel who had heard about the morning's events. That evening, she received an unexpected visitor. Master Sergeant Banks knocked on her door just after sunset, looking around carefully before entering her small apartment. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know that there are some people on this base who think you did the right thing today." Rebecca poured coffee for both of them, grateful for the first friendly conversation she'd had all day. "I'm not so sure about that, Master Sergeant. I may have just made the situation worse for everyone." Banks shook his head. "I've been in military aviation for 26 years, and I've seen what happens when safety concerns get buried under politics and careers. You may have saved that pilot's life today, and probably prevented a much bigger disaster down the road." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "There are things you need to know about Lieutenant Commander Harrison. He's been covering up maintenance issues for months, pressuring contractors and enlisted personnel to sign off on aircraft that should have been grounded for repairs." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. What kind of issues? Hydraulic system anomalies, avionics glitches, engine performance problems. Nothing that would cause an immediate crash, but the kind of things that add up over time. Harrison's been more concerned with maintaining operational readiness statistics than actually maintaining the aircraft. Banks pulled out a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "I've been keeping my own records, documenting the pressure he's been putting on maintenance staff. Several technicians have come to me privately, concerned about being forced to approve aircraft that they weren't comfortable with." Rebecca studied the notebook, recognizing a pattern of systematic maintenance, shortcuts and corner cutting that went far beyond the navigation system issue she had identified. "Why haven't you reported this up the chain of command?" "I've tried," Banks replied grimly. "Harrison has cultivated relationships with the right people at the regional level. My concerns get filed away or dismissed as the complaints of an old-timer who doesn't understand modern efficiency standards." He looked directly at Rebecca, his expression serious. "But now you've forced their hand. Congressional representatives witnessed a safety failure, and they're going to want answers. The investigation won't be able to ignore evidence if it's properly documented and presented." Rebecca realized that she had stumbled into something much larger than a single navigation system failure. Harrison wasn't just an incompetent officer making bad decisions. He was systematically compromising aircraft safety to advance his career, gambling with pilots' lives to maintain statistics that would look good in performance reviews. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Banks smiled grimly. "I need someone with your technical expertise to help me document everything properly." Someone who knows how to analyze failure patterns and present evidence in a way that can't be dismissed or buried. Over the next few days, Rebecca and Banks worked carefully to compile a comprehensive case file. Using her backup documentation and Banks's maintenance logs, they created a timeline that showed Harrison's pattern of pressuring staff to approve questionable aircraft, his systematic denial of legitimate safety concerns, and his willingness to risk lives for the sake of operational statistics. Captain Thompson sought out Rebecca on her third day of suspension, finding her in the base library where she was researching military maintenance regulations and safety protocols. "I wanted to thank you," he said, sitting down across from her at a secluded table. "The navigation system failed completely during my final approach. If I had been coming in from the north like originally planned, I might not have made it. The electromagnetic interference in that sector would have made instrument landing impossible." Rebecca looked up from the regulation manual she was studying. "I'm just glad you made it home safely, Captain. That's what matters." Thompson leaned forward, lowering his voice. "There's something else you should know. I've been having problems with aircraft systems for months, minor issues that I reported but never seemed to get properly addressed. After what happened yesterday, I started talking to other pilots. We're all experiencing similar problems." He pulled out a folded paper from his flight suit pocket. "I made a list of every system anomaly I've encountered in the past 6 months. Hydraulic pressure fluctuations, avionics glitches, engine performance variations. Individually, none of them were serious enough to ground an aircraft. But taken together, they paint a picture of systematic maintenance problems." Rebecca studied the list, recognizing several issues that corresponded to maintenance requests she had submitted and seen denied. "Have you shared this with the investigation team?" "Not yet," Thompson replied. "I wanted to talk to you first. Harrison has already been spreading word that you're a disgruntled contractor trying to create problems to avoid being fired. Some of the younger officers are buying into that narrative." Rebecca wasn't surprised by Harrison's strategy. Discrediting her character and motives was easier than addressing the technical issues she had raised. But she also knew that character assassination only worked if the evidence couldn't stand on its own. "Captain," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you trust my technical judgment based on your experience working with me?" Thompson didn't hesitate. "Absolutely. You've been right about every system issue you flagged. More right than some people with a lot more authority and higher clearance levels." Rebecca made a decision that would determine how the rest of the investigation played out. "Then I'm going to share something with you that might help save lives, but it's going to require you to trust me completely." She told Thompson about Banks's documentation of the broader maintenance problems, about the pattern of safety shortcuts and corner cutting that went far beyond her own concerns. She explained how Harrison had systematically pressured maintenance staff to approve aircraft that should have been grounded, and how congressional oversight might be the only way to force real change. Thompson listened in growing concern, occasionally asking technical questions that revealed his own deep understanding of aircraft systems. When Rebecca finished, he sat back in his chair with a grim expression. "This is bigger than just maintenance problems," he said finally. "This is about the fundamental integrity of our flight operations. If we can't trust our aircraft, we can't effectively complete our mission." He stood up, his decision made. "I'll testify to the investigation team about every system anomaly I've experienced, and I'll encourage other pilots to do the same." As Thompson left the library, Rebecca felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. She had found allies who were willing to speak up, but she also knew that Harrison wouldn't give up without a fight. The investigation was about to become a battle between competing versions of reality, with the safety of military aviation hanging in the balance. That night, As she prepared her final documentation package for the formal investigation, Rebecca thought about the cost of speaking truth to power. 7 years ago, she had learned that sometimes doing the right thing meant sacrificing everything you had worked to build. Now she was facing that same choice again, but this time she wasn't alone. The patch on her sleeve represented more than her own past. It represented a commitment to bringing people home safely, regardless of the personal cost. And sometimes, that commitment required more than technical expertise. Sometimes it required courage. The base conference room had been transformed into a formal hearing chamber with recording equipment, stenographer, and a panel of 3 investigating officers from the regional command. Congressman Walsh had used his influence to ensure that the investigation would be thorough and independent, with representatives from both the Inspector General's office and the House Armed Services Committee oversight staff. Rebecca sat at the witness table, her backup documentation spread before her in meticulously organized folders. Across the room, Lieutenant Commander Harrison conferred quietly with the base legal officer, occasionally glancing in her direction with barely concealed hostility. Colonel Patricia Williams, the lead investigating officer, called the hearing to order with crisp military precision. This investigation will examine allegations of improper maintenance procedures, safety protocol violations, and command decision-making regarding aircraft readiness at Ridgewater Air Force Base. She looked directly at Rebecca. Ms. Martinez, you are here as both a witness and a subject of investigation. Your actions during the congressional demonstration on Thursday morning constitute a breach of established protocol. However, your allegations regarding maintenance safety concerns require thorough examination. Rebecca stood to acknowledge the Colonel's statement. Yes, ma'am. I understand my situation, and I'm prepared to provide complete documentation of my concerns. The first phase of questioning focused on Rebecca's credentials and background. The investigating panel wanted to establish her technical qualifications before examining her specific allegations about aircraft safety. Ms. Martinez, Colonel Williams began. Your personnel file indicates you have extensive experience in aircraft maintenance. There are gaps in your employment history. Can you explain the 7-year period between your previous position and your current contract? Rebecca had anticipated this question and prepared her response carefully. During that period, I was involved in specialized aviation operations that are subject to classification restrictions. I can provide the relevant security clearance documentation if required. Lieutenant Colonel James Murphy, the second panel member, leaned forward. Are you saying you had previous military experience that isn't reflected in your current contractor status? I'm saying that my background includes operational experience with high-performance military aircraft under challenging conditions. That experience informs my approach to maintenance and safety protocols. Harrison's lawyer immediately objected. The witness is being deliberately vague about her background, possibly to create false credibility for allegations that lack technical merit. Colonel Williams silenced the objection with a gesture. We'll establish Ms. Martinez's credibility through examination of her technical analysis, not speculation about her background. The panel spent the next 2 hours reviewing Rebecca's documentation of the navigation system failure. Her photographs of the corroded connector, diagnostic data showing intermittent signal loss, and detailed analysis of failure patterns painted a clear picture of a genuine safety hazard that had been systematically ignored. Major Lisa Rodriguez, the third panel member, studied the maintenance logs carefully. Ms. Martinez, you submitted 17 separate reports about this navigation system anomaly. Can you walk us through Lieutenant Commander Harrison's responses to these reports? Rebecca opened her first folder, revealing printed copies of every maintenance request and denial. Each report was reviewed and denied within 24 hours. usually with notations that the observed anomalies were within acceptable parameters or that replacement parts were not immediately available. She pulled out a specific document. However, I also documented that identical replacement parts were available in the base inventory and that the repair would require less than 4 hours of labor. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy examined the denial forms. Mr. Harrison, these maintenance requests appear to document legitimate safety concerns. What was your rationale for denying them? Harrison stood, his posture rigid with military bearing. Sir, Ms. Martinez has a pattern of submitting excessive maintenance requests based on overly conservative interpretation of normal system variations. Military aircraft are designed to operate within broader tolerances than civilian equipment. Rebecca quietly pulled out another folder. Colonel Williams, if I may present additional documentation that addresses Commander Harrison's assertion about normal tolerances. The colonel nodded, and Rebecca spread out comparative analysis charts, showing failure patterns across multiple aircraft and time periods. These charts demonstrate that the navigation system anomalies I documented fall well outside normal operational parameters. Furthermore, I identified similar problems on 3 other aircraft that were also denied maintenance approval. Major Rodriguez studied the charts with growing concern. Ms. Martinez, are you saying that multiple aircraft were operating with compromised navigation systems? Yes, ma'am. And I can demonstrate that these problems are part of a broader pattern of maintenance shortcuts that compromise flight safety. Rebecca opened her final folder, revealing the comprehensive case file she had compiled with Master Sergeant Banks. The documentation showed systematic pressure on maintenance staff, denial of legitimate safety concerns, and manipulation of operational readiness statistics. The room fell silent as the investigating officers absorbed the scope of the allegations. Colonel Williams looked up from the documents with a grave expression. Ms. Martinez, you're alleging that Commander Harrison has systematically compromised aircraft safety across multiple systems and aircraft. This goes far beyond the single navigation failure that triggered this investigation. Yes, ma'am. The navigation system failure was simply the most dramatic example of an ongoing pattern of prioritizing operational statistics over pilot safety. Harrison's composure finally cracked. This is a witch hunt orchestrated by a disgruntled contractor who's about to be fired for incompetence. Ms. Martinez has no command authority, no operational experience, and no understanding of the pressures involved in maintaining military readiness. Rebecca remained calm, but her voice carried an edge of steel that hadn't been there before. Commander Harrison, you just said I have no operational experience. Would you like to reconsider that statement? Something in her tone made the entire room pay attention. Colonel Williams leaned forward. Ms. Martinez, are you prepared to clarify your operational background for this investigation? Rebecca reached into her jacket and carefully revealed the patch on her sleeve, positioning it so the panel could clearly see the faded black background, white hawk, and silver lightning bolts. With the hand-stitched designation, Night Falcon 1-3, the reaction was immediate and dramatic. Colonel Williams's eyes widened in recognition. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy sat back in his chair as if struck, and Major Rodriguez audibly drew in her breath. Night Falcon Squadron, Colonel Williams said quietly. That unit was disbanded 7 years ago after a classified mission. Rebecca met the colonel's gaze steadily. Yes, ma'am. I was the final surviving pilot from that squadron. Call sign Falcon 1-3. The revelation completely changed the dynamic in the room. Harrison's accusations about her lack of operational experience suddenly seemed not just wrong, but absurdly ignorant. The investigating officers were now looking at someone who had flown combat missions under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy spoke first. Miss Martinez, or should I say Major Martinez, your service record from that period is classified, but we're authorized to review it for this investigation. Are you willing to have your Night Falcon service examined as part of establishing your credibility? Rebecca nodded. Yes, sir. I believe my experience with equipment failures under combat conditions is directly relevant to the safety concerns I raised. Major Rodriguez addressed Harrison directly. Commander, did you know about Ms. Martinez's background when you were denying her maintenance requests? Harrison's face had gone pale. No, ma'am. Her contractor paperwork made no mention of prior military service or pilot qualifications. And if you had known, Colonel Williams continued, would that have changed your response to her safety concerns? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison understood that his answer would determine not just the outcome of this investigation, but the future of his military career. I would have given her concerns more thorough consideration, he admitted finally. Rebecca felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness at Harrison's admission. It confirmed what she had suspected, that her concerns had been dismissed not based on their technical merit, but because of assumptions about her background and qualifications. Colonel Williams called for a recess to allow the panel to review Rebecca's classified service record. As the room cleared, Rebecca sat alone at the witness table, knowing that the investigation had reached a turning point. She had revealed her identity as Falcon 1-3, the ghost pilot who had disappeared from military records 7 years ago. Now she would have to explain not just what she had observed at Ridgewater, but why she had chosen to leave her flying career behind and work in the shadows as a maintenance contractor. The patch on her sleeve was no longer a hidden reminder of past commitments. It was now evidence in a case that would determine whether military aviation prioritized politics or pilot safety. Master Sergeant Banks approached her during the recess, his expression mixing respect and concern. Ma'am, are you sure you want to open up those old files? Some things are better left classified. Rebecca looked out the window at the flight line, where aircraft were being prepared for afternoon training missions. Master Sergeant, 7 years ago, I learned that staying silent to protect yourself doesn't protect anyone else. I won't make that mistake again. She touched her patch, feeling the worn fabric that had traveled with her through combat missions, career changes, and the long journey toward understanding what it really meant to serve. Some stories need to be told, even when they hurt, especially when they might save lives. As the investigation prepared to resume, Rebecca knew that she was about to confront not just Harrison's negligence, but her own past and the decisions that had brought her to this moment. The battle for aircraft safety at Ridgewater was about to become something much more personal and much more important. The classified briefing room, adjacent to the main hearing chamber, was equipped with secure communication systems and soundproofing that created an almost oppressive silence. Rebecca sat across from the 3 investigating officers, her complete military service record spread across the table between them. Colonel Williams spoke first, her voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there during the public testimony. Major Martinez, your Night Falcon record is ... extraordinary. 47 combat missions, including 12 operations conducted under complete electronic warfare blackout conditions. Your final mission report makes for sobering reading. Rebecca kept her expression neutral, but her hands unconsciously moved to the worn coin in her pocket. The mission was compromised from the start, ma'am. Weather conditions were beyond operational limits, and our navigation systems were failing due to electromagnetic interference similar to what we've been experiencing here at Ridgewater. Lieutenant Colonel Murphy reviewed the mission summary with growing concern. According to this report, you were flying wing for Major Patricia Kyle when her aircraft took a lightning strike and lost all navigation capability. You guided her through a blind landing using improvised ground references and verbal communication. Yes, sir. But we lost 2 other aircraft in the same storm system. Lieutenant Sarah Chun and Captain Michael Rodriguez never made it back to base. Major Rodriguez looked up from the classified document. The investigation concluded that the mission should never have been authorized given the weather conditions and known electromagnetic interference in the target area. Multiple system failures were predictable and preventable. Rebecca felt the familiar weight of survivor's guilt, the burden she had carried for 7 years. "That's correct, ma'am." The mission commander ignored weather reports and equipment readiness concerns because political pressure demanded immediate action. Sound familiar? The parallel to Harrison's behavior at Ridgewater was unmistakable. Both cases involved commanders prioritizing external pressures over safety protocols, gambling with lives to meet operational demands. Colonel Williams closed the file and looked directly at Rebecca. "Major, you resigned your commission immediately after the Night Falcon investigation. Why did you choose to leave active duty instead of accepting reassignment?" "Because I realized that rank and authority weren't enough to prevent the kind of institutional negligence that killed my squadron mates. I thought I could do more good working from the ground up, focusing on the technical details that keep aircraft airworthy." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I was wrong about that, ma'am. Working without authority means your expertise gets dismissed by people who prioritize politics over safety. Sometimes you need rank to make people listen." Lieutenant Colonel Murphy leaned forward. "Are you saying you regret leaving active duty?" Rebecca considered the question for a long moment. "I regret that it took another near disaster to force people to pay attention to documented safety concerns. But I don't regret learning that prevention is more important than heroism." The panel spent another hour reviewing Rebecca's technical analysis of the broader maintenance problems at Ridgewater. Her documentation revealed a pattern of systematic corner cutting that went far beyond Harrison's individual decisions, suggesting institutional pressure from higher command levels to maintain operational readiness statistics regardless of actual aircraft condition. When they returned to the main hearing chamber, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. Word of Rebecca's identity had spread through the base, and the gallery was now filled with pilots, maintenance personnel, and senior officers who understood the significance of having a Night Falcon veteran testifying about safety concerns. Colonel Williams called the session to order with enhanced gravity. "This investigation has revealed information that extends beyond the immediate allegations against Lieutenant Commander Harrison. We will now hear testimony from additional witnesses regarding maintenance practices and safety protocols at Ridgewater Air Force Base." Captain Thompson was the first pilot to testify. His detailed account of system failures and near misses, painting a disturbing picture of aircraft that were technically airworthy but operating at the margins of safety. His testimony was followed by 3 other pilots who described similar experiences, each one corroborating Rebecca's analysis of systematic maintenance shortcuts. Master Sergeant Banks provided the most damaging testimony, revealing the pressure that Harrison had placed on maintenance staff to approve aircraft despite documented problems. His personal notes showed a pattern of intimidation and retaliation against personnel who raised safety concerns. "Commander Harrison made it clear that our performance evaluations would suffer if we grounded too many aircraft for maintenance," Banks testified. "He frequently reminded us that operational readiness statistics were being monitored at the highest levels and that careers depended on maintaining high availability rates." Harrison's defense began to crumble as witness after witness corroborated the allegations against him. His lawyer attempted to argue that he was following orders from higher command to maintain operational tempo, but the investigation panel wasn't sympathetic to claims that safety could be sacrificed for statistics. The turning point came when Danny Rodriguez, the young technician who had initially distanced himself from Rebecca, requested permission to testify. His nervousness was obvious as he approached the witness table, but his testimony was devastating. "I want to apologize to Ms. Martinez," he began, his voice shaking slightly. She tried to teach me proper inspection procedures, but I ignored her advice because Commander Harrison told us that civilian contractors didn't understand military requirements. He pulled out a small notebook from his pocket. I've been keeping track of the aircraft problems that Miss Martinez identified, but we were told to ignore. In the past 6 months, she flagged 23 separate issues that later caused in-flight malfunctions or emergency landings. Rodriguez looked directly at Harrison. Sir, I realize now that following your orders put pilots at risk. Ms. Martinez was trying to save lives, and we were too focused on avoiding paperwork to listen to her. Harrison's final defense collapsed when Colonel Williams presented evidence that he had been falsifying maintenance records to meet operational readiness targets. Computer forensics had revealed systematic deletion of safety reports and modification of inspection findings to show higher aircraft availability rates. Commander Harrison, Colonel Williams said with cold precision, you deliberately compromised flight safety to advance your career prospects. Your actions endangered the lives of pilots under your command and violated the fundamental trust that military aviation depends upon. Harrison stood at attention, his face pale but his military bearing intact. Ma'am, I acknowledge that my decisions may have been flawed, that they were made under extreme pressure to maintain operational readiness in challenging circumstances. Rebecca felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as she watched Harrison's career disintegrate. He wasn't an evil person, just someone who had lost sight of what really mattered when faced with institutional pressure and personal ambition. Colonel Williams addressed the full hearing chamber. This investigation has revealed systematic failures in maintenance oversight, safety reporting, and command decision-making that extend beyond any individual officer. Our recommendations will include comprehensive reforms to ensure that technical expertise is properly valued and safety concerns are addressed regardless of their source. She turned to Rebecca. Major Martinez, your decision to speak up during the congressional demonstration may have prevented a catastrophic accident. Your technical analysis and documentation will serve as the foundation for new safety protocols throughout the command. Rebecca stood to respond. Thank you, ma'am. But I want to emphasize that this wasn't about individual heroism. It was about listening to the people who work on these aircraft every day and trusting their professional judgment over statistical targets. As the formal investigation concluded, Rebecca realized that she had accomplished something more important than exposing Harrison's negligence. She had forced the military aviation community to confront the tension between operational pressure and safety culture, and she had proven that technical expertise deserved respect regardless of rank or authority. The patch on her sleeve no longer represented just her own past experiences. It had become a symbol of the responsibility that came with knowledge, and the courage required to speak truth to power when lives depended on it. But Rebecca also knew that the real work was just beginning. Changing institutional culture would require more than investigation reports and disciplinary action. It would require constant vigilance from people who understood that in aviation, there was no acceptable margin of error when it came to pilot safety. The base commander's office overlooked the flight line, providing a panoramic view of the aircraft. That represented both the pride and the responsibility of Ridgewater Air Force Base. Colonel Robert Hayes had requested a private meeting with Rebecca following the conclusion of the formal investigation, and his expression suggested that the conversation would be both difficult and important. Major Martinez, he began, using her former rank for the first time since her identity had been revealed. I owe you an apology on behalf of this entire command. Your safety concerns should have been taken seriously regardless of your contractor status, and the treatment you received from Lieutenant Commander Harrison was unacceptable. Rebecca sat across from the colonel's desk, her posture reflecting years of military bearing that civilian clothes couldn't completely disguise. Thank You, sir. But my concern isn't with apologies. It's with making sure this kind of institutional negligence doesn't happen again. Colonel Hayes nodded grimly. The regional command has already begun implementing comprehensive reforms based on your documentation and the investigation findings. Lieutenant Commander Harrison has been relieved of duty and will face courts-martial. Proceedings for falsifying maintenance records and endangering flight operations. He leaned forward, his expression serious. But I want to discuss your future here at Ridgewater. The investigating panel has recommended that you be offered a direct commission to return to active duty as a maintenance operations officer. Your technical expertise and operational experience would be invaluable in implementing the new safety protocols. Rebecca had anticipated this offer, but hearing it officially still caused a complex mix of emotions. 7 years ago, she had left active duty convinced that working from the ground up would be more effective than trying to change institutional culture from within. The investigation had proven both the value and the limitations of that approach. Colonel, I appreciate the offer, but I need to think carefully about where I can be most effective. The problem isn't just individual commanders like Harrison. It's a culture that values statistics over safety and treats technical expertise as subordinate to operational pressure. Colonel Hayes pulled out a thick folder from his desk drawer. Major, I want to show you something that might influence your decision. This is Harrison's complete performance record, including evaluations from his previous commands. Rebecca reviewed the documents with growing concern. Harrison's file showed a consistent pattern of prioritizing operational metrics over safety concerns, but it also revealed that his superiors had consistently rewarded this behavior with positive evaluations and promotions. He wasn't an aberration. She said finally, he was responding to institutional incentives that rewarded short-term readiness statistics over long-term safety culture. Exactly, Colonel Hayes confirmed. And that's why we need people like you in positions of authority. The regional command is establishing a new aircraft safety and readiness division that will have direct oversight of maintenance operations across multiple bases. They want you to head that division. Rebecca set down the file and looked out the window at the flight line where aircraft were being prepared for afternoon training missions. She could see technicians conducting the same inspections and maintenance procedures that had been compromised under Harrison's command, but now with enhanced oversight and documentation requirements. What authority would this position have? She asked. Complete authority to ground aircraft based on safety concerns, regardless of operational pressure. Direct reporting relationship to the regional commander, bypassing local command structures that might prioritize mission readiness over safety. And most importantly, the power to implement maintenance protocols based on technical expertise rather than administrative convenience. It was everything Rebecca had wished for during her months of fighting Harrison's negligence. But she also understood that authority came with responsibility that extended far beyond her own base. Colonel, if I accept this position, I need your commitment that safety concerns will be addressed based on technical merit, not political considerations. I've seen what happens when operational pressure overrides professional judgment. Colonel. Hayes stood and extended his hand. Major, you have my word that safety will be our highest priority, and that your technical expertise will be valued and supported at every level of command. 3 weeks later, Rebecca stood in the same conference room where the investigation had taken place. But now she was wearing the uniform of a major in the United States Air Force. The ceremony recommissioning her to active duty was attended by many of the same people who had testified during the investigation, including Captain Thompson, Master Sergeant Banks, and even Danny Rodriguez. Congressman Walsh, who had observed the entire investigation process, delivered remarks emphasizing the importance of technical expertise in military decision-making. Major Martinez has demonstrated that the most important qualification for ensuring flight safety isn't rank or seniority, but the courage to speak up when you know something is wrong. Harrison was notably absent from the ceremony. His courts-martial had resulted in dismissal from service and forfeiture of retirement benefits, sending a clear message throughout the command that falsifying safety records would not be tolerated. Rebecca's first act as head of the Aircraft Safety and Readiness Division was to establish new protocols requiring independent technical review of all maintenance decisions. Contractors and enlisted personnel were given direct access to safety reporting systems that bypassed local command structures, ensuring that concerns like hers would never again be buried by officers more concerned with statistics than pilot safety. She also instituted regular training programs focusing on the human factors aspects of maintenance, emphasizing the importance of trusting professional intuition, even when computer diagnostics suggested normal operation. The curriculum included case studies from her own experience, including the Night Falcon mission that had taught her the ultimate cost of ignoring safety concerns. 6 months after taking her new position, Rebecca received a letter that brought the story full circle. It was from Captain Thompson, who had been selected for advanced fighter training at the elite test pilot school. Major Martinez, the letter read, "I wanted you to know that the lessons you taught me about trusting professional judgment over computer diagnostics probably saved my life last week. During a test flight of new avionics systems, I experienced instrument failures similar to what happened during the congressional demonstration. Instead of relying on the backup systems, I followed your advice about using visual references and manual navigation to land safely." He continued, "The incident investigation revealed systematic problems with the new avionics package that would have caused multiple crashes if we hadn't identified them early. Your emphasis on human factors training and technical intuition prevented what could have been a catastrophic failure of an entire aircraft system." Rebecca smiled as she read the letter, understanding that this was exactly the kind of outcome that made all the personal and professional risks worthwhile. She wasn't just preventing individual accidents. She was changing the culture of military aviation to value technical expertise and professional judgment over blind adherence to statistics and procedures. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. Master Sergeant Banks knocked on her office door late one afternoon, carrying a small package wrapped in military-issued paper. "Ma'am," he said with unusual formality, "the enlisted maintenance personnel wanted to present you with something to recognize your service to flight safety." Inside the package was a custom-made patch, similar to her Night Falcon insignia but updated to reflect her new role. The design featured a white hawk perched on a wrench, with silver lightning bolts and the inscription, "Safety first, always." The design represents your transition from pilot to maintainer to safety officer, Banks explained. But the commitment to bringing people home safely remains the same. Rebecca felt tears forming in her eyes as she examined the patch. It represented not just her own journey, but the recognition that technical expertise and safety advocacy were valued and respected by the people who worked on aircraft every day. "Master Sergeant," she said quietly, "this is the highest honor I've ever received. Thank you." As Banks left her office, Rebecca looked out at the flight line where aircraft were being prepared for evening training missions. The same activities that had once been compromised by Harrison's negligence were now conducted with enhanced safety protocols and genuine respect for technical expertise. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles weren't fought in the cockpit, but in conference rooms and maintenance hangars where decisions were made about what constituted acceptable risk. And sometimes the most meaningful victories weren't dramatic aerial maneuvers, but quiet changes in institutional culture that ensured future generations of pilots would have the support they needed to complete their missions safely. The patch On her sleeve had evolved from a reminder of past loss to a symbol of ongoing commitment. But the essential message remained the same. In aviation, everyone has a responsibility to bring each other home, and that responsibility extends far beyond the cockpit to include everyone who touches an aircraft throughout its operational life. 2 years after the investigation that changed everything, Rebecca stood on the observation deck of the new Aircraft Safety Center at Ridgewater Air Force Base, watching the sunrise paint the flight line in shades of gold and orange. The facility had been built with funding secured by Congressman Walsh, who had become a powerful advocate for technical expertise in military decision-making. Below her, aircraft were being prepared for the day's training missions with procedures that bore little resemblance to the corner-cutting culture that had nearly cost Captain Thompson his life. Each inspection was thorough. Each safety concern was documented and addressed, and each maintenance worker understood that their professional judgment was valued and supported by command. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate. Changing institutional culture required constant vigilance and the willingness to challenge assumptions that had been accepted for decades. But the results spoke for themselves. Aircraft availability rates had actually improved as maintenance became more thorough and proactive, and pilot confidence in their equipment had reached levels not seen since the early days of the program. Rebecca's office in the safety center was filled with documentation that would have seemed impossible during Harrison's tenure. Maintenance logs that recorded even minor anomalies, analysis reports that tracked system performance trends across multiple aircraft, and training materials that emphasized the importance of human intuition and supplement to automated diagnostics. But the most important changes weren't visible in documentation or procedures. They were reflected in the attitudes and behaviors of the people who worked on aircraft every day. Technicians like Danny Rodriguez had become confident advocates for safety, speaking up about concerns without fear of retaliation. Senior enlisted personnel like Master Sergeant Banks had been empowered to challenge officers who tried to pressure them into approving questionable aircraft. A knock on her office door interrupted her morning reflection. Captain Thompson entered, now wearing the insignia of a test pilot and carrying news that would validate everything Rebecca had worked to achieve. "Major Martinez," he said with obvious excitement, "I wanted to share the results of the investigation into that avionics failure I wrote to you about last year." He handed her a classified report that detailed systematic problems with next-generation navigation systems, problems that had been identified early because of the human factors training and technical intuition protocols Rebecca had implemented. The manufacturer had to recall and redesign the entire system, Thompson continued. The failure modes we identified could have caused crashes across multiple aircraft types. Your emphasis on trusting professional judgment over computer diagnostics literally prevented dozens of potential accidents. Rebecca reviewed the report with satisfaction mixed with soberness. The investigation had revealed that the navigation system failures were similar to the problems she had identified at Ridgewater, suggesting that institutional pressure to ignore safety concerns was more widespread than anyone had realized. "Captain, this validates everything we've been trying to teach about the importance of technical expertise in safety decisions. But it also shows how much work we still have to do across the entire aviation community." Thompson nodded. "That's actually why I'm here, ma'am. The test pilot school has asked me to develop a curriculum on human factors in aircraft testing based on the protocols you've established here. They want to ensure that future test pilots understand the importance of working with maintenance personnel as partners in safety." The request represented a fundamental shift in military aviation culture, acknowledging that safety was a collaborative effort rather than the exclusive domain of pilots and engineers. Rebecca felt pride in knowing that the lessons learned at Ridgewater were being applied to prevent future accidents across the entire aviation community. Later that afternoon, Rebecca received an unexpected visitor. Danny Rodriguez, now a senior technician with his own team of maintenance personnel, came to her office carrying a worn notebook and wearing an expression of quiet determination. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to thank you for teaching me that speaking up about safety concerns isn't insubordination. It's professionalism." He opened the notebook to reveal detailed documentation of maintenance issues across multiple aircraft types, analysis that would have been dismissed as paranoia during Harrison's tenure, but was now recognized as valuable safety intelligence. "I've identified potential problems with hydraulic system sensors on the new trainer aircraft," Rodriguez continued. "The patterns are similar to what you documented with the navigation systems, and I think we need to investigate before they cause in-flight emergencies." Rebecca smiled as she reviewed Rodriguez's analysis, seeing the same attention to detail and pattern recognition that had once made her own concerns seem overly cautious to people who didn't understand the stakes involved. "Excellent work, Danny. Let's get this information to the manufacturer immediately and coordinate with other bases to see if they've observed similar problems." As Rodriguez left her office, Rebecca reflected on the transformation that had taken place not just in institutional procedures, but in the confidence and competence of individual maintenance personnel. They were no longer simply following checklists and meeting statistical targets. They were actively engaged in preventing accidents through careful observation and professional judgment. The evening brought a ceremony that would mark the culmination of Rebecca's journey from dismissed contractor to respected safety advocate. The regional command was presenting her with the Distinguished Flying Cross for her role in preventing multiple aircraft accidents through innovative safety protocols and courageous advocacy. But the award ceremony also included recognition for the many people who had supported her efforts to change institutional culture. Master Sergeant Banks received the Air Force Commendation Medal for his documentation of safety concerns under difficult circumstances. Captain Thompson was honored for his willingness to testify about system failures despite potential career risks. Even Danny Rodriguez received recognition for his transformation from reluctant follower to confident safety advocate. Congressman Walsh delivered the keynote address, emphasizing the broader implications of the Ridgewater investigation for military decision-making across all services. Major Martinez has demonstrated that technical expertise and professional courage are force multipliers that enhance our military capability far beyond what traditional metrics can measure. He continued, but more importantly, she has shown that institutional culture can be changed when individuals are willing to risk personal comfort for the greater good. The safety protocols developed here at Ridgewater are now being implemented across hundreds of installations, potentially preventing thousands of accidents and saving countless lives. As Rebecca accepted her award, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 7 years ago, she had been Falcon 1-3, a pilot whose squadron had been destroyed by institutional negligence and political pressure. The loss of Lieutenant Chun and Captain Rodriguez had taught her that individual heroism wasn't enough to prevent systematic failures, but her experience as a dismissed maintenance contractor had taught her something equally important, that changing institutions required patience, documentation, and the willingness to fight battles that might seem small, but had enormous consequences for the people who depended on those institutions. In her acceptance speech, Rebecca emphasized that the real victory wasn't her own vindication, but the cultural transformation that had made Ridgewater a model for technical excellence and safety advocacy. 7 years ago, I learned that silence in the face of institutional negligence is complicity in the consequences that follow, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed auditorium. Today, I'm proud to work in an environment where technical expertise is valued. Safety concerns are addressed promptly, and every person who touches an aircraft understands their responsibility to bring pilots home safely." She paused, touching the patch on her sleeve that had evolved from a reminder of loss to a symbol of ongoing commitment. "The patch I wear represents more than my own service or experience. It represents the promise that we make to each other every day, that we will use our knowledge and judgment to prevent the kind of accidents that destroy families and diminish our capability to defend our nation." As the ceremony concluded and people began filing out of the auditorium, Rebecca was approached by a young maintenance technician she didn't recognize. The woman was wearing coveralls similar to the ones Rebecca had worn as a contractor, and a nervous expression suggested she had something important to say. "Ma'am," the technician said quietly, "I wanted to thank you for making it possible for people like me to speak up about safety concerns. I'm working on a different aircraft type at another base, but I've been following the protocols you developed here." She pulled out a small notebook similar to the ones Rodriguez and Banks had shown Rebecca. "I've documented some potential problems with engine sensor calibration that might be causing performance variations. My supervisors haven't been receptive to my concerns, but I know that you've proven these issues need to be taken seriously." Rebecca felt a familiar combination of pride and concern as she reviewed the technician's documentation. The analysis was thorough and professional, suggesting genuine safety concerns that deserved immediate attention. But she also recognized the position the young woman was in, facing institutional resistance similar to what Rebecca had encountered with Harrison. "What's your name?" Rebecca asked. "Technical Sergeant Lisa Park, ma'am. I've been working on aircraft maintenance for 8 years, but this is the first time I've felt confident enough to document concerns that my supervisors might not want to hear." Rebecca smiled, understanding that her efforts to change institutional culture were having effects far beyond Ridgewater Air Force Base. "Sergeant Park, your documentation looks excellent, and your concerns appear to be well-founded. Would you be willing to coordinate with our safety center to investigate these issues and share the results with other installations?" The relief on Park's face was obvious. "Yes, ma'am. I just want to make sure these problems are addressed before they cause accidents." As Rebecca walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on the conversation with Sergeant Park and its implications for the future of aviation safety. The cultural changes that had begun with her confrontation with Harrison were spreading throughout the military aviation community, empowering technical personnel to advocate for safety without fear of retaliation. But she also understood that institutional change was an ongoing process, not a one-time victory. There would always be commanders who prioritized statistics over safety, always pressure to cut corners when resources were limited, always temptation to ignore problems that seemed manageable in the short term. The patch on her sleeve had evolved through multiple meanings over the years. As Falcon 1-3, it had represented her identity as a combat pilot. As a dismissed contractor, it had been a hidden reminder of past commitments. During the investigation, it had become evidence of her credibility and experience. Now, as head of the Aircraft Safety and Readiness Division, the badge represented something more comprehensive, the understanding that safety was everyone's responsibility, that technical expertise deserved respect regardless of rank or position, and that preventing accidents required constant vigilance from people who understood that the smallest details could have the largest consequences. Rebecca pulled out her worn coin and read the inscription that had guided her through the most difficult decisions of her career. "No lights, still land." The phrase had originally referred to her ability to navigate and land aircraft under impossible conditions, but she had learned that it applied equally to the challenge of maintaining professional integrity in institutional environments that didn't always value technical expertise, sometimes bringing people Home safely meant being willing to land in unfamiliar territory, to take career risks that seemed irrational to people who didn't understand the stakes involved. Sometimes it meant speaking up when silence would be easier, documenting problems that others preferred to ignore, and fighting battles that seemed small but had enormous consequences for the people who trusted their lives to the aircraft they maintained. Rebecca had learned that the most important flights weren't always the ones you piloted yourself. Sometimes they were the ones you made possible for others by ensuring that their aircraft were safe, their procedures were sound, and their concerns were heard by people with the authority to act. As she reached her quarters, Rebecca looked up at the stars that had once been her domain as a combat pilot. She no longer flew among them, but she had found something more meaningful than individual heroism: the satisfaction of knowing that her work made it possible for other pilots to navigate safely through the darkness and find their way home. The young maintenance technician who had approached her that evening reminded Rebecca that the battle for aviation safety was far from over. There were still commanders like Harrison at other bases, still institutional pressures that prioritized statistics over safety, still technical personnel who were afraid to speak up about concerns that could save lives. But there were also people like Sergeant Park, Captain Thompson, Master Sergeant Banks, and Danny Rodriguez who understood that safety was everyone's responsibility. They were the next generation of aviation professionals who would carry forward the lessons learned at Ridgewater, ensuring that technical expertise was valued and safety concerns were addressed, regardless of their source. Rebecca's story had begun with the loss of her squadron mates and the realization that institutional negligence could be as deadly as enemy fire. It had continued through years of quiet service as a maintenance contractor, building expertise while waiting for the opportunity to make a difference. The confrontation with Harrison had forced her to choose between personal security and professional integrity, and the investigation that followed had validated the importance of technical expertise in safety decisions. But the real victory wasn't her own vindication or Harrison's downfall. It was the transformation of institutional culture that made it possible for people like Sergeant Park to document safety concerns without fear of retaliation, for people like Danny Rodriguez to grow from reluctant followers into confident advocates, and for people like Captain Thompson to trust their professional judgment even when computers suggested everything was normal. The patch on Rebecca's sleeve would always carry the weight of past loss and the responsibility of ongoing commitment. But it also represented hope, the understanding that individual courage could change institutional culture, that technical expertise could prevent tragedies, and that the most important flight operations happened on the ground, where careful attention to detail and willingness to speak up about problems could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. As Rebecca prepared for sleep, she thought about the letter she would write to Sergeant Park the next morning, offering support and guidance for documenting her concerns about engine sensor calibration. She thought about the training programs she would develop to help technical personnel at other bases recognize and report safety concerns. She thought about the ongoing work of changing military aviation culture, one conversation and one documented concern at a time. 7 years ago, she had been Falcon 1-3, a pilot whose world had been shattered by institutional negligence and political pressure. Now she was Major Rebecca Martinez, head of the Aircraft Safety and Readiness Division, someone whose quiet persistence and technical expertise had prevented countless accidents and saved unknown numbers of lives. The journey from dismissed contractor to respected safety advocate had taught her that heroism wasn't always dramatic or immediately recognized. Sometimes it was as simple as paying attention to details that others overlooked, speaking up when something didn't seem right, and refusing to accept that accidents were inevitable when they were actually preventable. The coin in her pocket bore the inscription, "No lights, still land." But Rebecca had learned that the most important landings weren't the ones you made in darkness. They were the ones you made possible for others by ensuring that they never had to fly without lights in the first place. Her patch told a story of loss and redemption, of individual courage and institutional change, of the understanding that bringing people home safely was everyone's responsibility and everyone's honor. It was a story that would continue as long as people were willing to trust their professional judgment, document their concerns, and speak up when something didn't seem right. The flight line was quiet now, aircraft secured for the night and ready for tomorrow's missions. But Rebecca knew that somewhere, a maintenance technician was conducting one final inspection, catching a problem that might have caused an accident. Somewhere, a young pilot was studying weather patterns and equipment performance, learning to trust professional intuition as much as computer diagnostics. Somewhere, a commander was listening to safety concerns from technical personnel and taking action to address them. The lights would never go out completely as long as people like that were willing to stand watch. And Rebecca Martinez, once Falcon 1-3, now guardian of aviation safety, would continue to guide them home through whatever darkness they might encounter. Her story had become their story, and their commitment to safety had become her legacy. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the flight line was empty and the stars were brightest, Rebecca understood that she had found something more important than individual glory, the satisfaction of knowing that her work made it possible for others to fly safely and return home to the people who loved them. The patch on her sleeve would always remind her of the squadron mates who didn't make it home. But it also represented the countless pilots who would return safely because someone had been willing to speak up about a loose connector, a corroded sensor, or an unusual vibration that didn't seem quite right. That was the real meaning of no lights, still land. It wasn't about individual heroism in impossible circumstances. It was about creating the conditions where no one would ever have to land in the dark alone. If you enjoyed this story of courage, persistence, and the power of speaking up for what's right, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. We share inspiring tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Just like Rebecca Martinez showed us that sometimes the most important battles are fought not in the sky, but in conference rooms and maintenance hangars. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between staying quiet and speaking up for safety or what's right? Share your story with our community. Rebecca's journey from dismissed contractor to safety advocate reminds us that expertise and courage can come from unexpected places, and that standing up for others often requires more bravery than any individual heroic act. Her patch didn't just tell the story of her past. It became a symbol of her commitment to ensuring others could fly safely home. Thank you for joining us for this incredible story of transformation, justice, and the quiet heroes who keep us all safe. Until next time, remember that your voice matters, your expertise has value, and sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to stay silent when lives are on the line.